Does a simple increase in training bar diameter have a positive impact on strength and functional endurance within older adults, with the bottom line being that it is never too late to start lifting weights? So I'm happy to be here today. Thank you to Dr. Haber and the faculty for asking me to do this presentation. And it will be mostly on my thesis research that I've previously completed over the past couple of years. And again, happy to take any questions towards the end. So before I get too much into the presentation here, I'll just give a brief presentation overview so everyone kind of knows exactly where I'm leading on to with everything. For those of you who may not know me, I'll start with a personal introduction of myself, talking a little bit more specifically towards my master's journey, where I came from, kind of what my interests were, and how it led me to my thesis research itself. And getting more into the bulk of the presentation, I'll start by addressing the common questions surrounding what is sarcopenia, which is a muscle disease or disorder that I have been studying throughout my thesis research itself. Getting a little bit into the research value surrounding intervention strategies around sarcopenia, as well as the purpose statement, and of course, questions surrounding my previous thesis research. Finishing off with, of course, the research design through the sample of participants I pooled from, the protocol and the analysis, leading into the results and the implications moving forward, and what some areas of future research might benefit from including some of these types of parameters. So to start out, just a very quick introduction of myself and my master's journey. I began my master's journey late stages of 2017 after I graduated from the undergraduate program at the Faculty of Kinesiology and Health Studies at the U of R. I started out with a very high, strong interest in high performance sport. I was working as a strength and conditioning intern with the Rams and various teams on the Cougars as well. And eventually, after the first couple of years or the first year or so of my master's, that essentially kind of led into a transition towards a higher interest in clinical populations, where I actually started working at the Dr. Paul Schwann Applied Health and Research Center within their cardiac rehabilitation program, which I absolutely loved. And it made me think a little bit more as in terms of when I was going into my thesis proposal, how I could potentially take some training concepts from the high performance sport end and essentially apply these to particular clinical populations while targeting specific pathophysiology that I was interested in. And of course, at the time, I was really interested in more so like cardiology, things of that nature. But with my interests areas and my areas of expertise at the time as a clinical exercise physiologist, I kind of came across the research surrounding sarcopenia, which I'll again explain a little bit in the slides to come. But it led me to believe how I could kind of bridge the two interests that I have and how I could potentially start some research on that, which essentially led to my thesis proposal and my data collection over 2 semesters. It did take quite a while because I was doing most of the data collection myself, and due to limited space and taking in so many participants, it did take quite a bit of time, and which eventually led to my successful thesis defense, where I completed my master's in July of 2020, and then led to the transition into professional workplace, where I now work for a company called PVRI, which is a nonprofit company, and we kind of focus on interventional cardiology research. And it's been an amazing opportunity to kind of bridge the gap or bridge my interest areas of cardiology and research as a whole, and potentially moving forward to obviously my future career. So to start off, again, I'd like to address what is sarcopenia, the question that many people do end up asking me when I talk about my thesis research. And essentially, sarcopenia can be described or defined as a progressive loss of muscle mass and physical function occurring with an increase in age. And there are many different definitions for sarcopenia itself, some more intricate than others. I took this definition right from the Canadian Sarcopenia Foundation's website, and I thought it was suitable because the Canadian Sarcopenia Foundation is a nonprofit organization aimed at increasing prevention strategies across Canada while aiming at increasing treatment strategies as well as increasing knowledge translation through additional education for individuals that may be susceptible or at a higher risk of this muscle disease or disorder known as sarcopenia. So specifically within my thesis research, I definitely was more so focusing on the treatment aspect rather than the educational aspect. However, with that being said, personally, I do believe as a professional in the field that the bridging or the complement of the two together is what will really help move the country and even on a global scale forward towards the reduction in sarcopenia in individuals of an older age. So before we get too much into the study or into the presentation here, I also want to show you kind of what sarcopenia would look like. So in a research study published by Yang and colleagues in 2017, they're talking a little bit about what sarcopenia may look like on a more intricate level through MRI images and things of that nature. So I'll be showing everyone just very briefly an MRI image, and it'll be a cross-sectional area of the midline of the thigh. So right between the knee and the hip joint there, so that red area. And this cross-sectional area, starting from the left to right, we're going to start with the normal, quote unquote, air quotes, normal thigh muscle there. That really bright area you see in the middle is, of course, the femur bone. And the darker gray area around the bone itself is the lean tissue mass or the muscle mass itself. So you see on the normal leg muscle there on the far left, there's actually a very thin line, a white line around that area of muscle, and that's actually the fat tissue or the fat mass. So as you see there in the image next to it, in the obese individual, that thin white line is quite a bit thicker on this individual due to the increased level of fat mass. Whereas in sarcopenic individuals, and it's important to note that these individuals are the same age, so one individual has had a higher susceptibility to sarcopenia, potentially due to activities of daily living, lifestyle factors, things of that nature, which I'll definitely be touching on in the slides to come. But as you notice, not only is the fat or the thin white line around the muscle a little bit bigger, but the muscle itself is drastically or quite a bit smaller than that of a normal individual of the same age. So essentially what sarcopenia is, like I spoke of previously, is that age-related loss of muscle mass and function through strength levels as well. And I'll just touch on quickly that far right image known as sarcopenic obesity, or abbreviated as SO, is essentially someone that has gone through the process of sarcopenia, but they also have an increased level of fat mass as well. And this is problematic for a number of reasons, as it can increase the individual's susceptibility to adverse comorbidities such as cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, and things of that nature. So it is really prevalent in today's society, and it's important to increase research surrounding around these areas and targeting this specific area of health-related diseases. So moving forward here, it's important to note that specifically beyond the 5th decade of life, a range and continuous loss of muscle strength and muscle mass has been generally reported. And specifically for strength, as much as 1.5 to 5% on an annual basis has been attributed through literature research. And for muscle mass, as much as 1 to 2% on an annual basis. And if you think about it, those percentages may seem rough, like decently small, but for that individual on a high end, if someone is to lose 5% of their muscle strength on an annual basis after the age of 50, by the age of 60, a decade later, they might have already lost 50% of their muscular strength. So it's definitely a significant factor in terms of how this may impact that individual in the decades to come, in terms of activities of daily life and quality life as well. So at this point, I kind of encourage everyone to think about this to themselves just quickly, but how do you think we can offset this decrease in muscle mass and strength? Like, what do you think would be the best way to counteract this and potentially try and reverse or delay this process in aging muscle? One of the things that comes to mind is specifically resistance training. And, with this being said, there are a number of different ways that one can target this, specifically in terms of nutritional interventions, or lifestyle factors as well. But the general consensus throughout a lot of the literature surrounding this area of research shows that resistance training in an aging demographic is one of the best and most efficient ways to target and potentially help delay the onset of sarcopenia. So I put a little kind of visual depiction here, so it's just nice to see how one kind of leads into the other. Specifically, resistance training has been shown to lead to increases in strength and increases in muscle mass. With this being said, this can also reduce the difficulties of performing activities of daily life, which can also lead to the promotion of spontaneous physical activity, which can also lead back to more resistance training. And as you see here, one really does play into the other, and essentially it is all starting with an increase in physical activity. Specifically, resistance training has been shown to be one of the best ways to potentially increase muscle strength and muscular mass as well. But with that being said, a simple increase in physical activity like taking your dog for a walk or doing a little bit more gardening, things of that nature, will obviously help that as well. So it's important to note, though, that moving forward, it is one of the best things that people can do in terms of increasing the battle, if you will, against the onset of sarcopenia. So getting a little bit more specific into what I was previously looking at in my thesis research in terms of grip strength. So grip strength has been determined by physicians to be an important health measurement regarding older adults. And it's important to note that this is more so of a correlation, not necessarily a causation for total body strength. However, with that being said, it is a very precise and efficient way to easily and quickly and effectively, at that matter, take into account someone's upper body strength and be able to account taking averages and essentially correlating that with other individuals similar in a similar age bracket across Canada. And research has shown that there are somewhat correlations between total body strength. So this is one of the best reasons why grip strength has been shown to be one of the most favorable strength measures by physicians across the nation. So with that being said, grip strength specifically has a huge impact on a number of activities of daily living. And I encourage you to kind of think about some of the activities of daily living you think might be most susceptible to a reduction in grip strength as one goes through the aging process. So, and one of the first things I thought of personally, and I think many of you did as well, would be reaching grass tasks. So, for example, opening a door, opening medication containers, drinking from a cup, anything involving the manipulation of the forearm muscles, and as you're reaching and going to grasp an object of some sorts, would essentially be a direct attribute towards that individual's strength level. And it might be something that a lot of us take for granted, such as going and opening a door, for example. But as I spoke of previously, if an individual is losing on a high end up to 5% of their muscular strength on an annual basis, by the age of 70 or even the age of 80, these individuals might have a harder time, especially going through and doing daily tasks like opening a door, if they hadn't been susceptible to an increase in intervention towards decreasing the onset of sarcopenia itself. The next one, I think, is something that a lot of people may not think of. So it's in terms of ambulatory ability. And a lot of people may not think about this because if you think ambulatory, you're thinking, oh, well, someone may just take their dog for a walk or maybe strengthen their lower body in terms of endurance so they can more easily walk around. But specifically within the aging demographic, more so along the lines of starting at the 7th decade of life and the 8th decade of life, individuals using assistive walking devices rely on a heavy amount towards their upper body strength. And especially when you're using, if an individual is using a cane or a walker or things of that nature, they need to rely on having a strong enough grip strength to be able to not only hold that assistive walking device, but also be able to support their weight as well. So it's a really important aspect to think of. And not only that, but for individuals that are using wheelchairs as well, it's very applicable. If you think about having to, like an individual in a wheelchair, having to rely on their upper body to essentially be able to remain ambulatory and be able to move around and maintain that level of quality of life, it's really important to maintain that upper body strength. And the last one here, levels of functionality. So this is a really important one in terms of everyday lifestyle factors. So carrying groceries, gardening, and just general independence, moving boxes around your house, things of that nature, not having to rely on anyone to having to help because that level of strength has been maintained throughout those years. So I think that was one of the most important things moving forward that I was looking at specifically within my research study, as I'll talk about in some of the testing parameters that I actually ended up implementing within my thesis specifically. So this kind of brings up the question, why target grip strength specifically within a training intervention? And of course, I've already kind of touched on this in the previous slide here, but it's important to note that in a revised update regarding sarcopenia, the disease can now actually be categorized by low muscular masses, or low muscular strength as well, due to the vast health implications that this does have throughout the aging process itself. So with regards to targeting grip strength, essentially with the main goals of increasing strength and functional endurance of the upper limbs, as I spoke of previously, increasing independence throughout activities of daily living, which is very important. Of course, increasing general quality of life, as I've touched on previously as well. And what I think is almost the most important is the maintenance of that strength within the upper limbs in terms of longevity, and being able to apply that strength and be able to maintain that strength throughout those later years, so that that quality of life will remain higher than it would if someone had not increased or had been intervened towards those muscular adaptations throughout resistance training itself. So again, another question for you. How can we further improve this favored musculoskeletal adaptations attributable to strength training within this age demographic, and again, specifically towards the upper limbs? And this is the main question I had when I was going through some research when I was formulating my thesis proposal. And I thought it was really interesting because a lot of the research that I found when I was going through and looking into something that I might pursue, a lot of the research was surrounding lower body strength and lower body endurance. And for a good reason, don't get me wrong, ambulatory ability for those that are able to walk around is of grave importance, especially for fall incidence rates and things of that nature. However, with that being said, and I think I've made a pretty strong case for it in the previous slides, upper body strength is, if not just as or more important, to maintain for those individuals as well. And I probably wouldn't make the argument for more, but definitely as important moving forward. So how can we further improve these musculoskeletal adaptations? Well, for my thesis research, I came across these training grips, or these training intervention strategies, if you will, known as fat grips. So they look like this, and on the left there, you have the fat grips extreme. So it's kind of the orange training bar diameter, or the orange training bar attachment. And on the right, you have the blue fat grips original. The fat grips extreme is 3 inches in diameter, which equates to a nearly 200% increase in the training bar diameter. And when you think about that, that's a massive increase. So that hole in the middle where it would essentially attach on to either a barbell, a dumbbell, or a kettlebell, things of that nature, that's a typical a barbell diameter, if you will, which is about 1 inch. So it can increase up to 200%. It's crazy when you think about it. And the fat grips original will actually increase the training bar diameter by up to 105%. So it's still a substantial increase as well. And if you run into any of my participants and you ask that, and specifically my participants that use the fat grips, whether or not it made it any more challenging for the exercises, they'll probably tell you exactly what it did. And essentially it did increase that level of intensity. The idea behind them is that if you have a larger diameter on your training bar, in theory, that will create an environment where the individual needs to maintain a stronger grip to be able to hang on to that training bar attachment. So again, in theory, those individuals that are susceptible to this training bar attachment may potentially go through greater strength gains and also hypertrophy gains or muscle mass increases due to the increase of intensity for the exercises themselves. So before I get into a little bit of a lit review on the fat grips, just to kind of show you guys where the research has came and where it's going, I just wanted to bring up some quotes very quickly from the fat grips website itself, just to give you an idea of how something like this is actually marketed. And I thought it was really interesting because these fat grips are actually solely marketed towards high performance training atmospheres. So as you see here, we have a 4-time Mr. Olympia, world famous strength coach, Olympic athlete trainer, and even someone from the United States Secret Service saying, how amazing these fat grips are. You see in the top left corner there, like if you're serious about arm size, use these fat grips. All these very strong opinions based on these fat grips modalities, but essentially just applying and marketing them towards a high performance atmosphere. And the second I saw them on the website, I thought, hey, what's to stop someone from using these to essentially just increase their grip strength that isn't a part of a high performance atmosphere. So for example, someone, as I spoke of previously, past the fifth decade of life, that may be susceptible to a higher decrease rather in muscular strength and susceptible to a potential early onset of sarcopenia. What's to stop someone from using these to help increase the intensity level of their exercises to potentially offset that decrease in muscular strength? So with that being said, diving into a little bit of the fat grips research itself, of course, with any research around anything, there are pros and cons. Some of the pros, there is evidence towards these fat grips increasing muscular endurance, strength, and hypertrophy or muscle size, albeit limited. But they are easy to use, and they're extremely versatile. They're essentially a rubber casing that you can attach onto anything. So you can attach it onto any type of, like I said previously, like a training bar of a barbell, of a dumbbell, etc. However, with this being said, there are substantial cons, especially due to the extremely limited research on the fat grips themselves. Specifically, only young adults have actually been studied as participants until now, and a lack of clinical application for targeting muscle strength and hypertrophy is evident within the research. It was near impossible to find any studies that actually targeted a clinical population for an increase in or increase in training bar diameter size. So I thought it was a really kind of intriguing area to potentially start my thesis research due to a number of different reasons, but potentially trying to decrease this early onset of a decrease in muscular strength and hypertrophy. So moving on to my actual thesis purpose statement, essentially looking at whether or not a research study with the implementation of fat grips, training bar, and obviously an appropriate resistance training program would significantly increase hand grip and upper body strength, as well as functional endurance within an aging demographic past the fifth decade of life. So essentially starting with the intervention, so you see FG or C, that's fat grips or control group. So everyone was randomized into one of the two groups, leading into the resistance training program, which was 6 weeks in duration, and which led to the data analysis in terms of the results themselves. So the research questions that I kind of formulated at the beginning of my actual thesis proposal and which guided the research itself. The first one here, simply will hand grip strength increase? So when you take two groups, one group with the fat grips intervention and one group without the fat grips intervention, will there be a substantial or a significant increase in hand grip strength within the fat grips training group? Second, will hand grip endurance within both dynamic and static conditions increase as well? And I'll talk a little bit more about the dynamic and static conditions specifically in the slides to come. And will relative upper body strength increase when you compare the two groups as well? And as you see here, before I move on, it's just important to kind of tackle all parameters, if you will, of strength training in terms of a hand grip strength increase. So that's a maximal isometric test, which essentially means that an individual has to squeeze a hand grip dynamometer as tightly as they can, maximal effort. The hand grip endurance is more of a timed exercise itself, and then the upper body strength measurements I'll talk about in the slides to come, but we're talking a little bit more of 1 repetition maximum testing over cable resisted exercises. So moving a little bit into the methods here specific to my thesis research itself, I'll start with inclusion-exclusion criteria because this is of vital importance. It's very important to note who you are actually going to be researching and to make sure that these inclusion and exclusion criteria are sound moving forward so that you can actually aim to answer some of the questions that were formulated at the very beginning. So specific towards the inclusion criteria, again, as I spoke of previously, age being past the 5th decade of life, no contraindications to exercise, which is assessed by the GAQ or the Get Active Questionnaire, which is a standardized form assessing individuals' health history and suitability for exercising as supplied by the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology, which is the governing body that actually hands out or withholds the exercise therapy and training certifications across Canada. And third, the ability to communicate to the University of Regina for all training and testing sessions. Of course, this was of vital importance because it's very, very important, can't stress that enough, to be able to maintain a constant research atmosphere for every participant that's involved. The reason that I went through and created this training atmosphere at the University of Regina is that A, it was controlled, but B, I was the one that was actually there training with these participants every single training session. So I was able to make sure that every participant went through the process in the exact same manner due to the same protocol. That's very important. And of course, it's important that the exclusion criteria inhibits anyone from a history of fragility fractures or severe osteoarthritis from participating in the study due to the high level of strenuous physical activity that that I had the participants partaking in. Again, with this being said, same point as number one there. These individuals, it's not to say that they wouldn't benefit from doing any types of resistance training or even using the fat grips for that matter. However, with that being said, for this specific research study, it wasn't deemed appropriate. And third, there are diseases that are known to affect muscle biology. So any type of muscle glycogen deficiency disease, things of that nature, where someone doesn't have essentially the same energy stores as an individual not affected by that type of a disease. And anyone traveling during the study greater than duration of 2 weeks at a time. So moving on to the next slide here, the participant sample and statistical analysis. A power analysis indicated that 34 participants were required, which would equate to about 17 per group. And for all my fellow research nerds out there, as myself, I included a little bit more of the stats on the bottom there. But essentially it was for a 2x2 mixed model analysis of variance design between the two groups. And unfortunately, due to some limitations that I'll speak to more towards the end of the presentation, the total sample size of individuals or participants that actually completed the entirety of the study was only 29. So it did fall short of the power analysis that was indicated. However, with that being said, the experimental group and the control group were roughly about equal, being 15 and 14. And this leads to the importance of a baseline demographic information analysis, which I'll talk to you about previously or specifically right here. So this is actually an excerpt from my thesis. It's right from my thesis itself. And within this table, it's basically looking at the baseline demographic variables for both groups. And it's really important to look at whether or not both the experimental and control group are similar enough in terms of these variables being sex, age, BMI, hand size, and activity, in order to actually compare the results with certainty that these individuals may not be experiencing confounding variables surrounding these variables here. So of note, it is important to see here at the very bottom that there was a significant difference between activity between experimental and control group. However, between sex, age, BMI, and hand size, both groups were pretty much similar right across the board. With this being said, in the brackets there, those are the standard deviations of the groups themselves. And if you note at the bottom for the activity variable, the standard deviations are massive. And essentially what this means is that it was a very diverse group of participants with individuals ranging from 0 minutes of physical activity on a weekly basis to 400 minutes of physical activity on a weekly basis. However, with that being said, an additional inclusion criteria was that they could not have been involved in a direct professional training session in the past or previous 3 months from enrollment. So although some individuals were actually partaking in greater levels of physical activity on a weekly basis, all individuals were essentially untrained, and for that reason they were able to be compared across the two groups. But there was a difference between activity there. So the research design itself, it was a randomized controlled trial of 29 subjects, essentially meaning that individuals were randomized on a one-to-one basis to either the control group or the experimental group, where they went or when they underwent a 6-week resistance training program. The primary dependent variable, or the variable that was of most importance or most interest, was hand grip strength due to the clinical relevance, of course, as I spoke to previously. Secondary dependent variables, or variables that we were also looking at, were hand grip endurance within both static and dynamic conditions, and upper body strength determined by one repetition maximum testing over varying exercises. So moving on from this, getting more into the resistance training program design itself. So the programming goals, of course, were to achieve the appropriate dose-response relationship for a relative increase in attributable strength throughout the program itself, which is why 3 sets of 6 to 8 reps were chosen. With this specific age demographics, it's important to note that within a 6-week training period, the main goal essentially was to increase the strength levels of these individuals. And with that being said, that relative increase in resistance when appropriate, essentially what that means is when individuals were able to do an exercise for 3 sets of 8 full reps, that's 24 repetitions across 2 sequential resistance training sessions, on the next session that they came in, that weight would be increased as tolerated. So that kind of accounted for individual levels of strength increases throughout the program to maintain that level of an increase in strength as well. The program design specifically was only 2 training sessions per week. So the frequency and volume of this training session were relatively pretty low, especially being a 6-week resistance training program. However, with that being said, the results were pretty interesting for being such a short program, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit. But more specifically here, it started out with a 5-minute dynamic warm-up period. Started with the farmer's carry exercise, which is essentially just where someone picks up 2 dumbbells at a certain weight and they would walk on a 20-meter track for 3 sets with a minute break in between. They'd move on to the single arm dumbbell row, cable resisted pull down, as you see depicted there in the video picture. Number 5, the cable resisted bilateral biceps curl and cable resisted bilateral triceps extension. So these specific exercises were chosen very specifically by myself because in a resistance training program, and even just generally speaking, but specifically in a resistance training program that's so short and such low frequency, it's really important to maintain as many variables as possible. So with that being said, the farmer's carry kind of acted as more of an endurance exercise at the very beginning. The single arm dumbbell row being a single arm exercise kind of equated for that that single arm exercise as well. And the 3 cable resisted exercises all had a different level of hand position on the bar itself. So in the pull down, the bilateral pull down there, it had a pronated grip, and in the biceps curl, it had a supinated grip, so palms are facing up. And then in the triceps extension, there's a neutral grip position, so that they were training in all different parameters of that actual position in relative to the machine. So a little bit more specific in terms of the testing protocol itself for the dependent variables. It's important to note that all pre-testing, of course, took place before the second familiarization session, or during the second familiarization session, rather, prior to the beginning of the resistance training program, to get a true baseline of these participants' strength levels going into the program itself. With additional post-testing immediately following the 6-week intervention, with a minimum or maximum of 4 to 7 days following the final session. And it's important to note that to eliminate the chance of what's known as confirmation bias, because I was training all the participants, I actually had a fellow master's student come in and do all of the testing as well. And again, this is so that individual that came in and completed all the testing for all the participants had no idea which group these individuals were randomized into. So with that being said, it was kind of like a blinded set of eyes that could come in, do all the testing, and kind of have an unbiased resulting a period when they attributed or handed off the results to myself for data analysis. And the dependent variables, of course, hand grip strength, upper body strength, and hand grip endurance, as I spoke of previously. I showed you a picture earlier, the JAMR hand grip dynamometer, which is used for the hand grip strength. That's essentially the gold standard. Upper body strength with 1 repetition maximum testing over 3 cable resistant exercise conditions as per NSCA and CSEP protocols, which essentially just maintains a safe testing atmosphere, especially with individuals past the 5th decade of life, and specifically for those that don't have a history of experience with resistance training as well. In the hand grip endurance conditions, the static condition was determined by total time the individuals were able to hold 30% of their body weight in each hand in just a static standing position. And the dynamic condition was similar to the exercise of the farmer's carry that was implemented within the research study itself. The individual would hold 20% of their body weight per hand in the dynamic hand grip endurance condition, and they would walk on the same distance of track, 20 meters. However, they'd go back and forth as many times as possible, and we were measuring that in distance rather than time in meters. So very similar to carrying groceries. So getting a little bit more into the results here, this is kind of the exciting part because setting everything up is just as important, but actually being able to go through and run some of the statistical analysis is some of the stuff that's actually really exciting because we get to see whether or not this made a difference or not. So bear with me, I know the screen gets a little bit busy here, but just from a time perspective and just be able to really compare each chart together, I thought it was best to kind of put it on the same slide. So the first ones here you see in the top left corner there is the group mean total for grip strength. Underneath that is the group mean static grip endurance, and the upper right is the group mean dynamic grip endurance. So similar results were found for all outcomes regarding grip strength and endurance with significant main effects for time, except for the top right there for group mean dynamic grip endurance. That did not have a significant main effect for time. And essentially what that means is that these individual groups saw significant increases from an in-group basis pre-post test. However, when compared group to group, specifically for main effects for both group and interaction effects, there were not significant main effects. So essentially what this means is that the fat groups group didn't necessarily show a greater increase in strength or endurance within these testing parameters for that fat groups group in comparison to the control group. However, both groups did get significantly stronger, which is interesting still because it was only a 6-week training program where these individuals trained twice a week with minimum 48 hours in between. So it's interesting to see how training for 30 minutes twice a week for only 6 weeks can really show such substantial increases in strength, although there were no differences between the groups. So moving on here to the next 3 sets of graphs here. The top right there, group mean 1 repetition max lat pull down. Right underneath that, 1 RM biceps curl, and the top right, 1 RM triceps extension. So similar to the previous slide, there were similar results found for all outcomes regarding upper body strength tested through 1 repetition maximum testing, which were significant main effects for time. As I previously stated, it's the exact same. So within the group, there were significant increase in strength pre and post. However, there were non-significant main effects for both group and interaction effects as well. So with that being said, as I spoke of previously in the slide before this, it's important to note that within a 6-week training span, only training twice a week, these participants increased their strength in almost every single testing parameter that we tested them on, which was expected. You know, we're going through a pretty rigorous training regimen. However, with that being said, only 30 minutes twice a week for 6 weeks can be shown in these very, very favorable results. However, unfortunately, counterintuitive to the hypothesis that I thought the fat groups were going to make a big difference, they showed that there was a non-significant effect within the 2 groups. So moving on to some of the implications that these results do have. Although no significant group or interaction effects were found, as I just spoke of, there were significant strength gains evident in both groups, which is definitely a positive thing moving forward that can show resistance training this amount at this level only twice a week for 6 weeks can lead to great increases in strength and potentially maintenance of strength over the long term as well in terms of longevity. There's no evidence to suggest that training with fat groups will hinder, limit strength within this aging demographic. And I think that's an important point to note as well. So the individuals that were using the fat groups, even though they did not have a significant increase in strength when compared to the control group, there were still substantial strength increases as well. So there's no evidence to suggest that this would essentially hinder performance or attributable results as well. And it's important to note that through the implications, there were initial differences in training loads within the experimental group at the onset of the resistance training program. And just from a time perspective, I didn't make a full slide attributed to this, but I do want to mention it, is that at the beginning of the program itself, before the resistance training program started, there were 3 familiarization sessions. So the first session the participant came in, we essentially just signed some paperwork, signed an informed consent, made sure we were able to set a good schedule and that they knew exactly what they were getting themselves into. The second session, as I spoke of previously, was the testing session. So they didn't actually start any of the resistance training program. It was just a baseline testing. And this is where it gets really important. In the third familiarization session, before the resistance training program actually commenced, I took every participant through the full resistance training program and took specific percentages of their 1 repetition maximum tests and what their testing rates were at the endurance capacity for the farmer's carry. And we actually went and set appropriate weights that they would start the actual resistance training program with 3 sets of 8 repetitions relatively comfortably. And doing that, in that third familiarization session, no one had been randomized into either of the group yet. So every time one of the participants came through and went through that third familiarization session with me, they did not use the fat grips. And the reason I did that was because if an individual was randomized into the fat grips group, I was interested in seeing what difference of weight they were actually able to withstand when using the fat grips attachment itself. So, for example, if an individual was randomized into the fat grips group or the experimental group, in that third familiarization session, they came in, they set a specific weight in the farmer's carry that they were comfortable doing for 3 sets of 20 meters on the walking track. In that first resistance training session, when I put the fat grips attachment on those dumbbells, they essentially would have to go through with the same weight that we set without the grips. And then if they weren't able to complete the exercise with that same weight, I was keeping track of what type of reduction in terms of percentages we saw. So just important to note that out of 15 participants in the experimental group, 10 participants decreased the farmer's carry by an average of 28% reduction in weight when having to use the fat grips training bar attachments. So there was a pretty substantial decrease there, and there were also decreases in the other exercises as well. With that being said, of course, in the control group, there were no reductions in weight because their weights were set without the use of fat grips. So it was the same testing parameters. So moving on to the study limitations, and of course, these are really important to note. There are limitations in many studies. All studies, you could make the argument, but they are important to note moving forward because some of these limitations can have potentially negative effects on the results that you see from the study itself. So one of the limitations in terms of the participant sample, it's tough to actually administer whether or not the individuals were exerting themselves at the same effort level. And the initial strength level was also a matter of concern as well. As I spoke of previously, the inclusion criteria maintained that all the participants had not been in a supervised training session within the past 3 months. But with that being said, there were some participants that had a history of resistance training and some who had no history of resistance training. So there was a little bit of a mix in terms of quote unquote trained and untrained participants. So that can be a limitation in itself. The health measures, sleep and nutritional information were not taken into account. And unfortunately, these two limitations can also have a huge impact in terms of recovery. And towards the end of the training program, as the weights increased towards a pretty high end, a lot of the participants were really highly exerting themselves at like 3 sets of 6 reps at a very heavier weight that they would be used to for sure. By not taking into account sleep or nutritional information, it's hard to know whether or not all participants were recovering at the same rate. For outcome measures, there were no muscle size outcome measures in the study. There were just muscle endurance and muscle strength parameters. With that being said, in a 6-week training program, only training twice a week, you could probably make the argument that hypertrophy gains might not be evident. However, with that being said, without the appropriate outcome measures, we are unable to say. So that was a study limitation in itself, of course. The resistance training program, I talked about this previously, so I won't spend too much time on it, but in itself, with the low volume and low frequency at only 2 days per week, had these training sessions been potentially 3 days a week for 8 weeks duration, the results might have been more towards a significant range, right? So it's hard to say whether or not the length of the program had a negative impact on some of the results that we have seen. However, with that being said, it is interesting to kind of look at the analysis nonetheless. The COVID-19 global pandemic unfortunately had a huge hit on the amount of participants that were able to finish up the study itself. A total of 12 participants were unable to finish the study due to the fact that the COVID-19 global pandemic, obviously, as everyone knows, had kind of shut down a lot of the day-to-day activities at the University of Regina when we were just finishing up testing. So it's important to note that there were actually 43, I think I might have talked about this previously, but there were 43 participants initially enrolled in the study, and only 29 were able to finish, and a large chunk of that was due to the pandemic, unfortunately. But it's out of our control, and I was just happy that we were able to finish up, of course. And of course, the lack of previous research, and I kind of touched on this previously, but serving as a benchmark study, it's exciting nonetheless, but it is challenging because a lot of these testing parameters had to be formulated from scratch. So it's tough when you don't really have anything to compare itself to. So it kind of opens the door specifically for future research itself. So in conclusion, again, the 6-week study program was unfortunately not associated with significant differences regarding total grip strength, endurance, or upper body strength when compared to a controlled program. However, there were significant increases in these parameters within the group. So it was intriguing to see that although the groups were getting stronger, they were getting stronger more or less at the same rate. This kind of opens the area for future research, specifically within this area, regarding more strict parameters of participant selection and surveillance, as I spoke of in the limitations, with regards to outcome measures and health measures, things of that nature. And the emphasis on investigation surrounding initial training weight, as well as training volume and frequency parameters. So as I spoke of previously, if this training program may have been 8 weeks long for 3 sessions per week, these individual participants may have, we may have seen different results, of course, because it would have been a little bit longer and more strenuous on the body. However, with that being said, I did want to keep it not light, but I wanted to keep the training sessions low because it's important to kind of research the impact of training at only 30 minutes per session twice a week for such a short period of time and still being able to see significant results. So I'd like to thank everyone for your attendance. I really do appreciate everyone tuning in. And remember, whatever you do, always try to incorporate weightlifting into your lifestyle to ensure optimal strength maintenance, even if it's only a couple days a week, because it can definitely make the difference moving forward in the long term, especially after the 5th decade of life when you may be susceptible to an early onset of sarcopenia if you aren't taking that into account. So just to end off quickly before we kind of start opening up the floor for any questions you guys may have, I want to extend my thanks and acknowledgements, of course, to Dr. Paul Bruno, who is my direct supervisor throughout the study itself. Dr. Paul Bruno is a very knowledgeable man, and he was able to help me out with anything and everything throughout the study itself. So I really appreciate all your help with everything. Dr. Darren Kando and Dr. Scotty Butcher as committee members, they were a great help in terms of the write-up of the thesis itself. A special shout out to Eric Wu, who was the master's student, my fellow master's student at the time, who was able to help me out with the testing parameters to, again, eliminate that potential confirmation bias. Of course, all participants that took part in the study, I would not have been able to do this if it weren't for all the amazing participants that were able to take part in the study. It is a huge chunk of their time as well, and they weren't reimbursed in any way other than having to sit through my boring conversations and my rigorous training regimens. But hey, really appreciate all that they did. Of course, my colleagues at Prairie Vascular Research Inc. for helping support me throughout this process as well. And a special thanks goes out to both the faculties of Graduate Studies and Research and Kinesiology and Health Studies.